quickly get to, because we have to wind up at 1, and so I shall try and make my presentation a little shorter. I think we ended the last session on a slightly philosophical note. Both the discussants raise a very, very fundamental question that when we move beyond this question of producing and consuming, what is it that we are trying to do? And particularly as societies, where are we headed? Where are we going? What do we want to achieve? And can we, not merely as societies which have now become the cynosure of global attention because of our ability to reach certain growth levels and certain kind of reserves, but also as the inheritors of a civilization which has great depth and much to contribute to the world. So can this association at some point bring this question as to what and how we should contribute to world civilization in terms of how do we tackle questions of abundance, deprivation, inequality, diversity, difference. I mean, does the Indian and Chinese civilization offer those kind of windows and therefore help in charting out alternative visions which can take mankind into different directions as well. So I think there is a larger question here before India and China, a question which is of a fundamental philosophical nature. And I think it is good that we keep that in mind. Now, Kishan is a hard act to follow, and I think in many ways what he's done is he's brought alive the notion of sameness and difference. That even as we look at the kind of divergences in thinking, in responses, in behavior, there are underlying similarities, some of which could stem from this larger Asian civilizational matrix itself, because some of these similarities can be found across Asia, and it's not just India and China, but because if we treat these two as civilizational complexes, they affected the cultures of countries around them. So one is at that level, but at another level it is also about the way in which the two societies have evolved on either side of the Himalayas with a lot of interaction going on between them. That India in many ways contributed hugely to the way in which contemporary China has shaped. In fact, if we are talking the language of business and exports, I think India has made probably the biggest ever export in history. No, I was referring to Buddhism. That Buddhism went to China and transformed a country from the bottom. And we in fact do not have as much of those Buddhism in our country is not I think very vibrant at all. But in China it has become very, very substantial matrix. So in both these senses, the link between India and China is there's going to be a paper on Tagore later. I'm quite enthused, looking forward to listening to it. But Tagore's associate, Khan Yun-shan, who together they set up China Bhavan, which was the first attempt to concretize this understanding. His son, Professor Thanjung, who's an associate with our institute, has in fact emerged as the single most important proponent of the Sino-Indian cultural understanding. And he talks about moving beyond geopolitical frameworks, nation-state frameworks. He's talking about bringing the civilizational framework as the central arbiter of India-China interaction. He's written a lot of books about this across the Himalayan gap and so on. And his interesting theory is that this is a relationship that has been made by heaven, because it's China and India were, going back to the galactic ages, were separate. They were not neighbors. But so only when the Indian subcontinent crashed and the Himalayas were created, that this. So he in fact goes into a very different realm. But the limited point I'm making, and will put it as a centerpiece of this conclave, is that the cultural matrix will ultimately be the most crucial factor in the understanding that develops between India and China. Okay, now the canvas has been set, and as I said, Kishan has given us a very tantalizing, very interesting glimpses of the cultural dimension. Now, what I propose to do in the next half an hour is to quickly look at the contemporary political, cultural, not cultural in the sense that he was looking from the business perspective and so on, but identify those political and social forces that are shaping, altering, transforming the rhythms in China today. These are huge issues. They cannot be done justice in half an hour. My purpose is to flag them out, as it were. The rest will be up to you. We will give Rohit a set of references. Those of you, depending on your own interests, can delve deeper into these various things. Now, our starting point, of course, today is what China's economic development has brought and done to it, and the economic development leading to its greater integration with the world economy. Our story really starts at the turn of the century. Of course, there's a history, please. When I say I'm beginning the story here, it's only for the purposes of understanding what has come about in the last decade and a half, which needs to be learnt about. So, so between 98 and 2003, we see one of the most rapid phases of China's economic development, and it culminates with China's membership of the WTO. And the argument that I'm making is that it is this membership and China's willingness to abide by with international norms of business and commerce that we see a cascading effect taking place in politics and society. And the entire framework within which the Chinese went ahead was to make a distinction between the economic reforms and the political reforms. So grasp the political firmly and let go the economy. Of course, they had learnt their lessons from the collapse of the Soviet Union. So, glasnost and perestroika, they evolved a typically Chinese approach to it. So it's glasnost, as you know, is openness, and perestroika is restructuring. So in case of economy, they had huge amount of perestroika and glasnost, but in case of politics, they had gradual steps towards perestroika, but no glasnost. So it was keeping the politics firmly in hand and letting go the economy, providing immense opportunities to the Chinese citizens, relaxing state controls, and a whole lot of things which. Now, of course, the argument that is made by scholars is that you can only go so far with this kind of a formula, that eventually your economic reforms will come up against the political wall. That there are many decisions that you have to take in the economic and business sense, which starts to affect your politics. And then what do you do? And this has been seen most strikingly, especially since its adherence to the WTO. The whole idea of corporates, that the new corporate entities that emerged, and these are, mind you, all state controlled, but how much of leeway do you give to these entities? Autonomy do you give to these entities to ensure that they have efficient governance? Separation of the party and the government from business, how much, how far, how fast? This Beijing consensus model, that is that you keep the state as the dominant player, that in many ways continues to adhere today. All these therefore raised questions about the extent of state control and how to let go and so on. So the limited point that I will make here is that it has been a long story about gradual relaxation of controls. And yet, the state is the agency which is still in charge. But on that, the Chinese have not made very many adjustments or compromises. In fact, it's facing up to the fact that today, more than 60% of the Chinese economy comes from the non-state sector. And that's really a huge leverage that the private players or the entrepreneurs or the new economic forces are able to exercise. And that is certainly having its own impact. So when it was decided that the party would have to respond to these new economic forces by opening up the party to membership of these forces, that was a major strike. Major strike in the way the Communist Party, which is the lead player in the Chinese political firmament, was positioning itself vis-a-vis the new reality that was coming about. Opening up the party to new economic forces, new sectors and new interest groups which are now going to be having some stakes in the party. This was a gradual process that we see from 2003-4 onwards. And there are huge debates taking place within the party, within among the intellectual circles, think tanks, and yet what you've seen is a very, very slow process of relaxation of controls. So this is clearly going to be the reality, continue to be the reality for the foreseeable future. Liberalization, yes, the party keeps talking about liberalization, but the core is going to be the party. Liberalization, not in the Western sense, not in any Indian sense as we understand it, no general elections, no competition among different political parties, but yes, greater scope for interpretation of the rules and regulations that govern the state and the society relations. So what I'm saying, giving before you is a picture of a continued iron hand with which politics will be controlled. And that is something that we will have to deal. There are debates on how these transformations will come about. The current president Xi Jinping has also led, a recent book of his has come out, it's called Governance in China. And so the Chinese are very happy in telling me that, look, we don't talk about good governance, we talk about governance. That's our style, is governance. So there are essays over here which talk about rule by law. But in this phase, what we are going to look at is Chinese exercising authority, and what we will see is rule by law, not rule of law. And that is something that I don't need to. Okay, the second dimension of the political shifts and change has been, one is of course this relaxation of control and greater autonomy to the economic players in the government. The other is about transforming the party and dealing with the that has been identified since 2004, which is that of corruption. The nexus, linkages that have been built up between the party and these new economic forces, which has led to the party getting a very bad name among the general people. The disconnect that has slowly come between the Communist Party and the masses. These are issues that are going to pose great challenges. In other words, if since the last decade of the 20th century, the party's legitimacy was based on delivering economic growth and ensuring that the larger number of people were getting more prosperous, living standards were increasing. So economic growth as the basis of the legitimacy of the party. Today, it continues to be that. However, it has to be in the context of the negative fallout of the reforms, where large numbers of people have been left out of the whole prosperity, where the imbalances in the economy have come up in major ways, imbalance between the rural countryside and the urban areas, imbalance between regional imbalances, coastal areas are more developed than the interior. So the challenges before the economy, and mention has been made about the increasing dissatisfaction and protests that are being reflected in the demonstrations, in the strikes and so on. I think the actual number of the protests is far larger. It's not just 10,000 here, I think it's much more. How much do we make of it? I think it's important to realize that large countries like India and China witness these million mutinies all the time. But there is, I mean, it's like this, that it is quite possible, in fact it is something that we are seeing for fairly large amounts of disorder to coexist with order. And we see that in India and China all the time. What does that signify? That just signifies that the process of jostling and adjustment of different interests sometimes takes violent turns and sometimes carries on in its usual, maybe some democratic channels and so on. So this whole process whereby a party is readjusting its position vis-a-vis society, now having to negotiate between the demands of different groups that have emerged, not possibly able to satisfy each one, is a severe challenge. So how do you reinvent yourself? And therefore Xi Jinping's current interface with the Chinese people is about the way in which he's carrying on this fight against corruption. Last 2 years we've seen enormous scandals. Some really top leaders in the party have tumbled. Of course, the discourse on the anti-corruption is always interspersed with stories of political vendetta, different factions trying to outdo the other by ensnaring some people. So those stories are there. But the fact is that it is as much about the political dynamics and the factional distribution of power within the party, as much as Xi Jinping's concern that the party has to reclaim its position, its image as the only force that can lead China to greater and greater victories. So earlier on it was about fast growth. Today the party can put a whole lot of achievements before the people. So you talk about sending a man to the moon, you talk about these great advances in alternate, in technology, 10 trillion foreign exchange reserves, biggest economy, so on and so forth. And these are huge achievements. So it's a combination of both, but we have to see that this is not going to be easy, because the Chinese society in the meantime has not stayed static. It's no longer about peasants and proletariat, which constitute the two large components. In 2004, the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences did a big study on changes that had come about in society in 20 years of reform. And what they found was that we were now looking at a highly stratified society, and that there were as many as 16 different levels at which you could identify. And these strata, mind you, are socio-economic. They are not casteist, these are socio-economic strata. And so it was a very fine kind of gradation. Part of the attempt of the study was also to show that, okay, there's not such a drastic gap between the haves and the have-nots, that you have a whole range of people. You have the lower middle, the upper middle, the lower rich, so they did a whole, and based on the employment status, income levels, on so on and so forth. But that's in 2004. And of course the rise of different groups and so on. So that is. Now, accompanying this opening up to the outside world has been a process of China has opened up to the world and the world has come into China. And it's quite interesting that over the last 10 years, I mean, people who go to China, every time they come back amazed, what is happening. But we have to see that two factors have really transformed people's perceptions and people's lives in China. One has certainly been this opening up to the outside world and the post-WTO changes that have come about in the Chinese political economy. At the other level, you have this opening up and the information technology and the communication, revolution in communications. And so the rise of the internet and this greater engagement with the world has produced a great upheaval here. Let me start with taking the internet. I think that this is, and I'm just going to identify in the next 5 to 7 minutes 6 or 7 dimensions of these two factors. Contributions to the changing dynamics. Of course, one must also remember that this point that I was mentioning earlier about the Chinese opening up, WTO accession, there has been a tremendous process of learning from the outside world that has accompanied this opening up. That it's not that our tendency to think of China as this monolith where the parties controlling everything, where they are not letting any foreign influences penetrate. It's not the case anymore. And right from the turn of the century, we see the Chinese opening up and, in fact, signifying their urgent need to learn from the world. So they look at the Americans and they look at the Japanese, and a lot of institutions are actually copied from the Americans. So they set up a Ministry of Commerce, which is very much on the lines of the American ministry. They set up a Center for Disease Control in 2003, which is exactly pattern of the Americans. They start inviting a whole lot of scholars, technical people, giving them jobs in the state-owned enterprises at pretty high levels and salaries commensurate with the global salaries. And this whole push to learn, absorb, borrow is one of the most remarkable aspects of the Communist Party's adaptation to this new reality. I don't know whether you heard this, but Kissinger has said in the context of India-China comparison that the Chinese are a closed society with an open mind, but India is an open society with a closed mind. And this opened mind is demonstrated very, very amply since 1998 onwards, when there is this huge. And it's also interesting to keep in mind that this has historically been the case in China. And from the Tang Dynasty downwards, you will see right up to the Qing, there was this steady stream of philosophers, historians, teachers, which were invited to China, which went to China and actually made China their home and taught there and so on. And SARS in that sense becomes a turning point in the current era, because when the SARS thing happened, I mean, something very interesting happened, which is that the Chinese opened up their doors to the WHO medical teams that went there. And the Beijing mayor made an announcement, public announcement, that I will give an office right next to mine, for the officials to sit here, and we will offer them all possible information. We will hide nothing, etc., etc. So important for them to show that they were genuine about complying with the global standards and so on. And the WHO team was there for about a month, and they went to all sorts of places, and everything was opened up for them. So that's an interesting turning point. Right, now the internet and the other social platforms, media, this has really changed social dynamics in China. And as you know, China is one of the largest internet users in the world. But since the last decade, we have seen an intensification in this battle between the state and the internet. It's quite clear that this is seen as a fundamental challenge by the Chinese state. In fact, there was a study conducted by Harvard sometime in 2008, 9 or thereabouts, which pointed out that China had the largest number of internet policemen in the world. And by rough estimates, more than 1 million net policemen. But just to indicate, the Chinese way of doing it, sometime in 2003, a sensational case broke out in Shanghai. There was a young teenage dropout from school who got the name of genius hacker. He hacked just about every site, from government to party to so and so. He was caught, and he was promptly offered a job by the state as their star net policeman. And now he's working for the state, and he's doing a great job out there. But the fact is that one of the most extensive net censorships are what is being seen, and it helped because in China all internet users have to officially register with the state, and they also have to use officially approved agencies. But the Chinese have found innovative ways of beating this. Of course, the overall condition is characterized by great censorship, but the Chinese language, for one, and technology is great. I mean, if it imposes one check on you, it shows you the way to beat that check, and so this is a constant battle. But the fact is that the internet today is the means for instant communication, for organizing, say, views or opposition to certain schemes, for bringing together people of similar views on a similar platform. And so this has been seen now as contributing greatly to the way in which protest movements are happening.
Question to that. Do you then see an Arab Spring-like situation happening in China soon?
No, because my point would be that the extent of discontent or opposition to the state is not as widespread or as complete. You have sections which have, and it's interesting that a lot of this discontentment is finding expression in terms not as down with the party. I mean, there are people who are absolutely anti-party and anti the system. But the opposition is couched in the way in which the rules and regulations are being abused by the people in authority. So it's not the system per se, but the governance, and therefore Xi Jinping's emphasis on governance. So the internet and its world, that's one thing which is shaping political, social and economic dynamics. The second is what has been described in the Chinese media as the red businessman and the rise of the red businessman, which essentially means two groups of people, many of course, but two dominant groups. One, those within the party who have linkages with the business world, and those entrepreneurs and businessmen who are where they are, billionaires and millionaires, because of their patronage by the party. And these people are becoming more and more and more influential in the entire system. Now, the Chinese are very clear. There is no capitalism in China. So you don't have a role being played by these businessmen, which a typical capitalist would play in a capitalist society. You have 100 billionaires and you have about 500 millionaires. So you have enormous personal wealth. But these are not independent capitalists. They are entrepreneurs who really need it rich. Now
how
this.
they are different, madam? The Chinese billionaire, how they are different from the Indian billionaire? How do you perceive their differences? When we say they are not, China is not a capitalistic country, it is a communist. So how do you perceive the
I wouldn't say it's a communist country anymore, but it has capitalism with Chinese characteristics, as they say. No, so why I say the difference between that there are billionaires, but they are not capitalists. It's essentially capitalist. I mean, this is what we are taught in basic political sciences. A capitalist is one who owns the means of production. So in China, there are no individual owners of means of production. It's all owned by the state.
Not true anymore. Not true.
Carry on, let's continue.
I'm sorry. For
Yes.
example, Alibaba is owned by Jack Ma.
No, but how is it a means of production?
Today means of production has changed.
No. This is a very this is an interesting debate. In fact, we are planning
Okay,
to
let's talk about it some other time.
Yeah, because-
But I would seriously challenge the notion that there are no capitalists in China in the way you define capitalism. Sorry for expressing a disagreement, but it shows
No,
the
perfectly.
plurality.
This is-
The argumentative Indian, that's me.
No. I think this is potentially one of the most interesting debates that need to be undertaken because, of course, I mean, one is the Chinese position itself. Of course, we can all have our differences about what kind of capitalism, what is this capitalism with characteristics, and whether this is just a fig leaf. I mean, all that is there. But I'm making a limited point here that it is, yes.
Sorry. Let's handle questions after your presentation.
Okay,
I'm so sorry.
No, you're right, absolutely.
Okay, so the limited point that I was making here is that the state continues to be the major arbiter here. That it has permitted an environment where people have become billionaires and millionaires. And that there's still, I mean, the essential levers of control are still with the state. So let's leave it at that. Now, these red businessmen are playing a dual role as well, because while you have a large number of this which is supporting the state and which is actually in sync with the state, you also have a large number of entrepreneurs who are now aligning interests with the different groups, liberal groups which are wanting greater changes in the political spectrum, those which are demanding more rights, more liberal space for operations. People who are arguing that there should not be a monopoly of power by the Communist Party. There are all these groups, and some of these red businessmen are actually supporting some of these groups. So for the party, the big challenge is how do you ensure that these people who are beholden to you for their wealth continue to be loyal to you. So this is a big thing, because red businessmen are found top to bottom across the country, and they are transforming quite a few. The rise of the middle classes. With this study that showed that there was a 16-layered stratification of Chinese society. The middle classes, which are extremely diverse, and I'll put a whole lot of sections here. I mean, the middle classes would encompass typically the intelligentsia, the different professionals, maybe journalists, and so on. So you have a whole lot of groups of people here. There is also a debate whether the rise of this new middle class as one of the most powerful groups in Chinese society amounts to a civil society having emerged, and therefore playing the traditional role of a civil society in terms of intervening in the political process, bringing about transformation in the way the political parties are conceptualizing or planning policies and so on. That, however, is seen in very different ways. In other words, we are seeing different groups within these middle classes which are questioning the extent of the government control over their lives. Okay, and this questioning is coming up in different ways. One is in terms of the pressure groups that have emerged. And these pressure groups are mainly protesting about policies which have a heavy human toll, particularly in the environment sector. And the largest number of NGOs that have emerged. Of course, the NGO sector is another part of this whole matrix of middle classes and their effectiveness. So, but of course, again, like the internet control NGOs, we must understand, although there are a huge number, I'm not too sure, but in the first decade of the 21st century, the NGOs were growing at about 6 to 8% a year in the total size. So the role of the NGOs, but
their number or their
at the rate of growth.
number?
I won't have the exact number, but it
Their
runs.
rate was in the number of NGOs?
Yeah, the rate of growth of the NGOs was, and something like, some say, let's say it was about 50,000 NGOs in China, so they were growing at 6% a year in the first decade. So that's how rapidly it was growing. But of course, we must understand that the NGO sector is a government-led sector. And it is described in the Chinese media as official, non-official, mass-based organizations. And a lot of things are channelized. You have some problem there? Okay. Maybe we can come in later. So the NGO sector is one, the intelligentsia, the intellectuals and other professionals. Pressure groups which now have emerged across a variety of sectors, the environment, as I said, was one. There's another very strong pressure group that has come up, which is anti-eviction. That in this push for infrastructure development, building huge mega projects like dams and so on, a lot of eviction of people takes place. And even these huge malls that come up. So anti-eviction groups are very, very strong in the Chinese parliament today. Migrant labor is one huge issue. We have in fact a Chinese lawyer who was employed as, who was working with one of these NGOs, legal NGOs which were championing the cause of migrant labor, their rights, their so on, who's now teaching in Delhi in Jindal Public School. And she had given a presentation very interesting about the way in which they're working in tandem with the authorities, but they're ensuring that justice is being done to these groups. Then you have a new thing which has come up in the last 5 years is pressure groups which are fighting for the rights of the left behind children. This is a huge, huge problem in China. Parents leave their villages, go to the cities, and migrant, as you know, population is huge, leave their children behind. Very often with nobody. So the rights of these left behind children, consumer rights has become huge, particularly in the wake of the scandals related to pollution and the kind of things that were happening to food and milk poisoning and so on. Religious rights, this is a newly emerging field. So what I'm trying to give you is a picture of these pressure groups operating largely through their specialized networks, using social platforms, but raising these issues. And over and above all this is the media. Now, the media no longer is one controlled kind of entity. Of course, the state has its own agencies. Yes, the state has its own 60 channels on which they show you only Japanese, anti-Japanese kind of thing. But there is a lot of South Korean TV, Indian serials, so the Chinese fare is diversifying. So, essentially, it shows a kind of the cauldron is bubbling. It's bubbling with a whole lot of activity, with a whole lot of new ways in which the state-society interface is unfolding. And I think we need to understand that to continue to see this as a monolithic, communist party-dominated, controlled system will be a mistake. So, so we are at a crossroads in many senses. We have a party which is increasingly stressing the need for governance because they realize that there are these pockets. At the moment they are isolated, so they've done two things. Not only have they tried to keep all these different pressure groups operating in their own they also tried to restrict the expansion of these pressure groups. Because if it's one thing, expansion in terms of numbers, because if it's one thing that would become a very serious problem is if the numbers that are simply protesting become too huge. The last example that we had was the Falun Gong. The Chinese cracked down on it with the heaviest possible hands because it was not only becoming numerically big, it had branches all across China, and it was beginning to attract more and more adherents. So the possibility of some kind of an uprising which is organized and systematic and which can immediately bring together thousands of people on the streets is something that the party will not tolerate. So pressure groups, to the extent that they do allow people to engage, responsiveness. In fact, it's interesting that many of the protests that have been witnessed in the last 5 years has actually had some support from the state itself. The state is actually positioning itself along with these demands, or you would say the cries for justice and so on. The fact that people still go to do these petitions shows that there are many loopholes still in the system in China. So the Chinese government is on the one hand dealing with this, on the other hand I think they are debating this whole question of where is the Chinese model headed. The costs in terms of the environment, costs in terms of a complete transformation of the epidemics of the Chinese. I mean, diseases are surfacing. Tuberculosis, which had been eliminated, is once again back. Cancer is on the rise. There are cancer villages. The challenge that the Chinese are now potentially looking at is prompting a rethink. So that's at one level. There is a society which is on the march. There is this whole phenomenon of the China #1 economy. I think it's a massive challenge that we have to study all these different dimensions and see what are the implications of the way they will develop as far as we are concerned. So I'll just quickly stop there. It's already if there are, who's my discussant?
Discussants.
I am one of them.
Oh, sorry. So sorry.
No, that's okay.
No, I was actually very fascinated by the last portion of your talk, where you mentioned that the protests are actually, if not engineered, but certainly abetted by the state. Now, that goes contrary to almost anything that we know or understand of the word protest. And the analogy that came to me was, our good old Hawkins and Prestige pressure cookers, where periodically there's a whistle that blows off a bit of steam, and then it chugs along again, and a little later it blows off a little bit more steam. I mean, do you think the government is actually therefore allowing a little bit of steam to be blown off, but not really loosening the reins at all? Yeah?
That would be the
So you...
I would say that they are actually engineering, but they are not suppressing.
Yeah.
And particularly, you see, where there are cases where the sons of leaders are involved in these mega projects and the protests come up, then they are even more careful to see that it does not appear as if what is.
So it's not that there's going to be any real change
No, it is.
going forward.
It is.
It is?
Most of these people are able to push through. No, I would say the change is coming, because what is happening is that these protests are able to actually push reversal decisions in many cases. They are able to stop. They're able to get justice done to people who have been unjustly dealt with. So there are a lot of success stories in terms of how people are able to get their demands met. I mean, there are these cases of particularly some huge, recent one in Yunnan, a huge hydroelectric power project. The person who was one of the leaders of this project happened to be the son of Li Peng, who was a former prime minister. And I mean, some of the most famous academics and scholars in China joined this protest march, and a huge petition was signed, and they actually had to backtrack. So in that sense, you see a lot of responsiveness and a lot of, sometimes they have to do it on the back foot, sometimes they realize the importance of giving in to the demands. So I think these protests are making a change, and they are actually alerting society to the kind of...
So they're taking a very constructive response to the protests.
I would say so. On the whole, I think they have shown remarkably, given the fact that they are very clear that the political power is not about to be distributed among different political parties, but they have shown a responsiveness that is notable.
Hello. Do you see any contradiction in the concept of market socialism, which we learned from China when China was changing from its ideological perspective?
Well, ostensibly, you would say that these are antithetical terms, market and socialism.
That's a term we learned from China.
Yeah, but no, not quite, because the Chinese picked it up from the East Europeans. And in fact, if you go back to Hungary or Czechoslovakia, I mean, some of the first reforms which brought the market into the whole economic system, and the whole shift from a very centralized planned approach to opening the economy to market forces first happens in East Europe. And Chinese
but probably the success story is China on that.
Sure, I mean that could be
compared to the others that you have
yes,
mentioned.
of course. And the entire debate about market socialism in China has been that market is value neutral in a sense. That a market can operate in a capitalist society, it can operate in a socialist society. The question is, what are the terms of reference, and what is the manner in which the market relates to the economic forces that determines the character. So you can well have market operating in a socialist setup without it becoming a contradiction. And for them, the notion of socialism was state control. So as long as state controlled a certain aspect of the economy, a certain percentage of the total economy, certain commanding heights of the economy, and so on, it characterized a socialist system, and the market was being controlled by the state also.
Since time is running out, I just have one more question. Maybe we can take it up during the dialogues to follow. Do you see the possibility of emergence of a unique Chinese model, which is uniquely Asian and not kind of a patchwork between the East and the West?
I think what we are seeing already is a uniquely Chinese model, and they call it the Beijing Consensus. Books have been written on the Beijing Consensus, which essentially refers to a state-dominated market economy. And that has many ramifications, of course, many dimensions, but that is, and the Chinese do offer it as a model. In fact, in their dealings with the African countries, they say, well, here's the Beijing model. So from the Washington Consensus to the Beijing model. So I don't know whether you can say that can it be transcended across Asia, because there are varieties of capitalism in Asia and varieties of market socialism in Asia. So I think each Asian society can borrow from each other, but whether it will be a one-size-fits-all, I doubt it. I mean, even we are trying to evolve our own model from a mixed economy and so on. So I would say that this has to be, any economic strategy, developmental strategy will have to be shaped in accordance with country-specific characteristics, level of development, resources, and so on.
Well, before I hand over for questions, the question which I have is the kind of pressure which the Indian governments have across on trying to bridge inequality, take care of the poverty, keep the capitalists in control. Are there pressure of the similar kind in China as well, or there are none?
I think there are huge pressures. There are huge pressures, and you can see this. I mean, if you follow the Chinese media, or if you follow the social media, you will see that there is a relentless questioning, criticism, oblique criticism, direct criticism of what is happening in Chinese society, ranging from economic injustices of a very basic kind to very, very fundamental questions like what we were talking about at the end. That what are we doing? Where are we going? And recently, a couple of cases which actually brings this into the spotlight. The most recent case, in fact, just 2 days before, I was reading about a journalist who was taking a flight, and he became ill in the flight, and when he reached Beijing, he asked the airlines to help them, and they said, well, we had an ambulance waiting in Beijing. So we reached Beijing, they did not, and he was in agony. Nobody in the aircraft even gave him a hand to get off the plane. And none of the passengers, they all sort of went by the side and went off. He actually crawled down the steps. And he comes down to the tarmac, and there is this ambulance waiting. And he said, look, I can't stand up. And he was doubled up with pain. I can't stand up. Please put that there's some kind of a hydraulic system whereby you get a lift and you put it. The man said, look, I can't operate the hydraulic system from inside. I'll have to get off. Why don't you just come in? And so he crawled in, and then he went to this hospital where he was told that we can't go to that hospital because it's too full. So the sense, agony went on through the night, and then finally he made the doctors call a friend of his, who then shifted him to a proper hospital, and just in time, because he was about to have this major burst, some complication in this. That, and he, mind you, was a journalist based in Hollywood. And that has triggered off. I mean, today if you look at the newspapers, you'll see it's triggered off. Now this man has said, I will not take any compensation. I will not use the media. I will be an ordinary citizen and fight for this. Of course, he said my problem is not, and he tried to absorb the airlines. He said, look, at the end of the day, they are all part of a system. They have been sued, and therefore they are very careful. My problem is with that ambulance which was down. It was his duty to take me to the proper hospital. And so he's fighting this, he's suing that hospital. And there are huge numbers of people who are supporting his argument. And this is being tied up because everybody is writing in to say, yes, there was this incident where a child was knocked over on the road and was bleeding. And they're saying, where are we going as a society? What are our values? What is the, where are the Chinese values and evidence? Where are we as a community? What is happening to us? Why are we becoming so human? Is money the only thing? So, fundamental questions are coming up. And I think it is a society which is questioning the last 30 years in many ways.
But still, the right-based approach is treated.
No, these are about rights.
No. The American understanding.
No. This is about
Otherwise,
right. This man is fighting for his right. The evictors are fighting for their right to their land. The environmentalists are fighting for the right. It's about rights, but certainly not the liberal democratic conception of rights. I mean, that of course would be. Everybody is hungry now.
No, I don't have any question, but a response to what Kushi was saying about the Arab Spring. It is a super hypothetical question that whether Arab Spring will happen in China or not. But what my understanding is this: the Chinese growth of development is something like arranged marriage, where parents from both sides are engaged. In Chinese economic development, if you look at the Chinese CPC structure and the membership, there are about 80 million members. Most of the provinces and states have their stakes in the economic development. So what happens really, why there won't be abrupt disruption or Arab Spring in China, because the provincial leaders, the business groups would intervene before it reaches to center. The system is not very much populist. And if you look at Arab Spring, the nature of state mechanism was very much populist over there. There was no institutional structuralism between the head and the population. In China, They deliberately created a mechanism, no matter how you look at it, how we blame it, our perception. But there is a mechanism. How corrupt is that is a different question altogether. But there is a mechanism which would stop that kind of Arab Spring to take place in China. Now, second, my comment or response to Rohit, when he was saying that there are a lot of problems, certainly there are a lot of problems, and especially 2015 and 16 and 17 will be full of problems. When Xi Jinping took his power in 12, he did not want to experiment in 13. So 2013, everybody waited. So obviously nothing happened in 2013. And why it had happened to happen in this 2015? Because there are a lot of things are happening in 2016. And 2015, like SDR basket, that is one. Second thing is about WTO market economy status is happening next year, 2016. The 5-year plan is starting from 2016. So 2015, only 2015, these things or changes have to happen in 2015. China is in hurry. A lot of problems. They cannot compromise on holding inflation. They cannot compromise on controlling interest rate. I mean, these are the problems. And then you need to understand it from a little behavioral economic approach, not from completely macro and macroeconomic approach that, okay, these are the agents, these are the like premises and theorems, and this will happen, this will lead to this. Economists always fail. They never predicted 1929, 1973, 1992, 1998, 2008. Had they predicted, we wouldn't have the fault. So my basic assumption is that yes, there are problems, there are lots of problems. But the thing is that they have this knack of, like controlling it. And that is where the model, China model, they have a model certainly. If you look at the provinces, the way they are dealing the problem, they're competing very fiercely. Santosh will come on that later on, how the Chinese provinces are dealing and approaching the foreign investors. Come to me and deal with me. And the way they have dealt with the balancing between, the provinces are not really happy with the fiscal relationship, fiscal decentralization between center and state, but they are managing it. So I think there is a model, China model, and we can certainly.
I just add there is business about controlling and responding. An instance in October, under the aegis of the Communist Party school, a huge conference was organized in Beijing on corruption. And they invited some 80 people from across the world to discuss the issue of corruption in China today as a systemic problem, as a practical problem, as can you imagine government of India or one of the parties organizing a global conference on corruption in India? Somewhere there is this sense that we would like to, and the whole idea was also to open it up for discussion and generate ideas which you can use, you can move further in understanding.
And also to create, I'm talking about the luxury market, how the anti-corruption thing has affected that.
Let me offer you a different perspective. First it shows the plurality of views, even within kind of single organization. But then we are not a regimented outfit in any fashion. But I want to add a point that has contributed to the discussion yet, and that is the quote-unquote Chinese model. The Beijing consensus is an old story, and I don't think the Chinese today very much talk about it. The deeper elements of the uniquely Chinese model have been explored by a person who is a professor in China, at Tsinghua, by the name of Bell. I think his first name is Daniel Bell, but I could be wrong. And I've just reviewed his book. The title of
The mic.
Sorry, the title of his book is The Chinese Model. That's the first title, and then there is a subtitle which I forget. And I've just reviewed his book. What he offers as the unique element in the Chinese model is that it's a political meritocracy. It's a very interesting point, a very important point. Because going back to the 6th century, China has had its famous imperial examination system. Leaving the history part aside, and this is worth reading up if anybody is interested in how a meritocracy system operates, because the Indian civil service was modeled on the Chinese imperial examination. But fast forwarding it to today, what Bell says, and he's largely right, but not entirely, in my view. He is right in saying that there is a rigorous process through which cadre selection takes place in China. It is largely an objective process, and at every stage in an official's career, which really means party cadre. We are really talking about party cadres because you can be a non-party person, but you really won't get terribly far, whether you're a professor or a diplomat or a civil servant or even a businessman, frankly. So you are tested, very, very tough tests. There is a huge emphasis on education, and that is why all Chinese leaders hold degrees. But then some of these degrees are slightly bogus. There is a man called Chen Li, who is the greatest analyst of Chinese personalities. He's located at Brookings Institution. He's a Chinese, of course, but an American Chinese. Chen Li has a database and has a research methodology of Chinese personalities, which is so good that the Chinese Communist Party, he visits China all the time, asked him to share it. And Chen Li laughed and said, sorry, he said, this is my trade in stock, I cannot possibly give this to you. Anyway, Chen Li made the point before Mr. 11 or C, whatever you want to call him, took over as president. He said in a discussion in Delhi about 3 years ago that Xi Jinping has a PhD. But he said, I think this belongs to the category of bogus PhD because he earned it while he was governor of a province. And he said, there is no way that a governor of a province can find the time to write a real PhD thesis because Chinese PhDs are not easy. I mean, we have a friend here who is about to get an MA dissertation. They are not easy. They are, I would say, far tougher than Indian doctorates or MPhil programs. And he said it cannot be done. But anyway, let's go back to the Chinese model, and I'll just finish in a minute. It's very rigorous to the point that a person who becomes a vice minister, no, not a vice minister, a director in a department, he is one of 1,70,000 people. That is the extent of screening. All this is wonderful. When you come to the party school, every promotion you have to go to the party school. And the party school can fail you. And if they fail you, your promotion is revoked. And that happens all the time. Vice ministers, provincial governors have their promotions revoked. But the catch is that this is still a flawed system. Because it makes room for what the unique Chinese word tells us, princelings. Princelings exist in pretty substantial numbers, to a point where a statistical average analysis would tell you this defies the odds. It cannot be that so many sons, mostly sons of important people, are in that position, starting with President Xi. Bell acknowledges this, and Bell says, yes, there is a princeling problem, but he said this will This was an aberration that came in the early 90s when the political meritocracy system was under development, and he said this will disappear in 20 to 30 years. Nice hope. What Bell doesn't address is the reality that tied with this meritocracy system, which is good, is an extraordinary amount of systemic corruption. Alka has talked about a conference that the Chinese organized, and she's talked about 80 people, international people who were invited. Forgive me, I know I will get many brickbats for mentioning this, but who are these 80? They were friends of China. See, I go back to what I had to say a little earlier in the morning. China imposes a kind of self-censorship on its quote-unquote friends. And those friends, once you are called an old friend of China, the code of behavior that is implicitly, gently suggested to you is that you shall not publicly be critical of it. And this is how it works. And it's not a new story. There was a conference held in Vienna in 1967, early 1970, when I was a young officer at the Indian mission in Geneva. It was a delightful conference, 2-day affair. First day, everybody let their hair down. All the academics said, you know, these damn Chinese. I mean, they didn't say damn in open conference. They more or less expect us to write only good stuff about China, and if we are critical, our access to China is pulled. We can't get visas. And everybody spoke very candidly. On day 2, Mr. Paul Lin arrived. Now, Paul Lin is a person who should be really studied. He's an outstandingly brilliant man who was a Chinese academic, I think at McGill University in Canada, but I could be wrong about the university. Paul Lin in the 70s, late 60s and 70s, had the right of refusal of visa to any new academic from North America. He was the person to whom a reference would go, and Paul would say, yes, and you could get your visa, otherwise you couldn't get a visa. In those days, visas were treasured. They were not easy to obtain. And when Paul Lin arrived, the entire tone of discussion in the conference changed. All these guys who had been letting their hair down about the Chinese system and how the Chinese imposed a code of behavior, shut up. So what I'm trying to say is that there are bigger flaws in the Chinese system than what my good friend Prof Alka Acharya suggests. I am in fairly strong disagreement with her on this, but she's entitled to her viewpoint, and it's very possible that I'm completely wrong. Thank you.
I just want to answer one question which has gone unaddressed. Nobody answered it. I think he asked one question. What is the difference between Chinese capitalist and Indian capitalist? So just a simple, I just wanted to end with completeness. So Chinese, all Chinese rich people are first generation rich people because it was all wiped out before that.
Right.
And the other differences, there are capitalists, like Indian capitalists are people who produce capital from capital. Whereas in China, whether it's internet entrepreneurs or real estate entrepreneurs, they have generated wealth through whichever industry, through nothing. They might have had political goodwill which they have sort of encashed or something. So that's the difference. And the other question which I think went unaddressed was, the state control aspect. The traditional view of state control is that state owns an assets, manages it, administers it, decides what the price of the commodity is. That's the old model. I think now what China has moved towards is where the state is quite nimble. Whether it is managing protests or whether it is managing the economy, it's far more nimble than what it used to be. So I'll give you some examples. I don't know how many of you are familiar with household names in China, but the Wanda Group is a big real estate group. And about 3 or 4 years ago, the Chinese government decided that the services sectors must be encouraged as a share of GDP. So Wanda immediately went on an acquisition spree around the world and picked up strange things which they would never. They're just a real estate developer like DLF or someone in Delhi. But now they own a yacht company called Sunseeker. It's a top-line luxury yacht in the UK. They bought it. They don't know what to do. It's bleeding money, but they bought it. The second thing they did was they went to Hollywood and summoned all the celebrities, paying them very high amount of fees just to show up in Qingdao, sorry, not Qingdao, Dalian, where the chairman of Wanda, it's his hometown, and the state gave him prime property along the marina. This is all was done to encourage the entertainment industry from a direction which stemmed from the state. So Wanda is a listed company, they are answerable to shareholders, there's no state control in the conventional sense, but it's not restrictive state control, but it's directive state control. So one more thing is, I think you mentioned Jack Ma. So Jack Ma has become rich because of Alibaba and all of that. And now the state stepped in. He's established as an entrepreneur, the state has allowed him to prosper. So now he has to pay his dues. And how does he pay his dues? So the Chinese government wants to reform the banking system, and it's very difficult. Banks are very powerful in China, they're mammoth organizations, it's difficult to reform. I think a few months ago, the Chinese government said it's okay if Alibaba gets into this e-wallet and the cash banking system, the cash transfer. They can basically do whatever they want. So today, Alibaba can take on all the banks. And why is he doing that? Because the Chinese government wants to reform the banks. But to actually do it the hard way is quite difficult. It might take 20 years to reform each bank, asset by asset, and converting bad assets into good assets and reducing the ratio of bad loans. So they're just injecting Alibaba into the system, saying you have a good collection of customers, you know their spending habits, you can credit rate them very easily. So you go ahead and become a bank. You do what you want. You get a blanket license. So this is state control. So it's no longer about what the state controlling everything, but the state using these elements of the socialist market economy, whatever has come up, because they have to. And the same thing happens with Tencent. This happens with almost every established Chinese company. There are certain things that they will do when the state says, because that's in service of the economy and the country. And this is state control today. So the state is quite nimble. It has its own NGO law. In March this year, the NGO law came out. And until then, I think all these statistics about how many NGOs are there, what they're doing was completely opaque. So now it's transparent. And the biggest category are government organizations, erstwhile government organizations, which were given independence in a gradual manner and some kind of hidden funding. So now they have emerged as the largest category of NGOs. And now there's a new class of NGOs which are no-go kind of human rights, that kind of thing.
There are genuine NGOs also.
Yeah, so there are genuine NGOs also. So now they have an option. You register and you comply with your funding and you get approval for every project, and now they will be allowed. I think now the consultation period is almost over. So now maybe by early next year the law will come. So this is, I think I have not read his book yet, but I was planning to get an autographed copy next week. So I think nimbleness is one essential aspect of the Chinese government. It's a huge thing, but it's very nimble. So that explains how it can manage these kind of inconsistencies and sort of maneuver itself and get what it wants without allowing anyone to say it's all like this. So it will always go in a maneuvering way and get its way. So I think if there are any other unanswered questions, we'll be happy to just wrap it up before lunch.